One of the questions I wanted to ask, but in this genuine because I'm slightly torn about the answer, is the extent to which politicians, British politicians, I suppose, in particular, are rising to the occasion. And I was particularly struck. I mean, it is only words, but words in these situations matter. Some of the words they put out, Liz Truss is making a speech somewhere today. And I mean, you wouldn't describe the extracts they put out necessarily as Churchillian. But also in terms of policy too. Is much of Britain's response still seems quite uh, normal, traditional, orthodox. Priti Patel will be dragged kicking and screaming to a big open offer on Ukrainian refugees, but not without going through the, treating it like a mine. The idea they could come here and pick fruit if they wanted to. Danny, what do you make of that idea of we're slightly lacking to not quite rising to the occasion?
Yeah, I don't fully agree with that. Let's first of all say the right thing to do, obviously, to look at any government responses. What more can be done? Where do we think it's going not far enough? And I certainly would agree that on visas they've got work to do. I want to see what they've got to propose. I'm not happy with what we've got so far. We've got to go further. But one of the reasons why Germany has risen further than we have is because it had further to go. Britain has really been very early in on the Ukraine issue and critical to Ukraine's ability to resist. It's not just been weapons that we've helped supply, but also Operation Orbital, the training that we were putting in. And I'm just influenced in this. As you know, on this program, I've been very critical of the Johnson government and of the Prime Minister. So it's not just a sort of question of blind loyalty because he's a Tory and, so am I. It is influenced by my friends in Ukraine who've said to me, on the ground, who've said to me, actually, I'm generally very critical of Boris Johnson, but I think he's been very important to us here. And they've been pretty impressed by the British government's response. It doesn't mean that we've done everything. So if you look at, even the central bank sanctions or the fact that the SWIFT policy doesn't cover oil, doesn't cover energy supply, and therefore there's a big hole in those things. It doesn't mean they've done everything, but that may not actually be that sensible an idea at this point anyway, because you probably need to have the ability to ratchet up further as you go through the crisis and have some things that you can still do. So what I would say is I think it's reasonable to criticise the government for the things that it hasn't done, but within the context that its overall response, I think, has been appropriate.
David, your take?
I think the first thing to say is that in the scheme of things, this is such an international crisis and a crisis for the alliance that what an individual country does, unless it's the United States, frankly, is a bit at the margins. It's what we collectively do overall. The more I think about it, the more I think that I realize that an almost existential problem has occurred as a result of what Vladimir Putin has done. It's the biggest crisis we've faced since the Second World War, bar absolutely none at all, certainly on the continent of Europe. And a very big question is going to be whether or not we find ourselves, whether we like it or not, sucked into conflict, proper conflict in one way or another as a consequence of it. I mean, let's just remind ourselves that the sharp wisdom from very good people was that Putin was some kind of pragmatist who, even if he did do something horrible in Ukraine, would limit it to the Donbass and Luhansk. And remember all that stuff about breakaway regions. And the clarity with which we now understand his actual objectives and what they mean in terms of the extinction of an independent country in Europe, a country of 40 million people, by its neighbor, which is not something we actually can allow to stand. And it does mean that whatever the consequences, it is going to have to find a way of being reversed. There's going to be incredible pressure in the next couple of days for a far bigger and much more perilous response on the part of the West. So that's the background to it, Matt, really. Now, within the context of that, of course, in some ways, the British government in some ways has acted with a dexterity where its own interests were not directly affected, or not quite so directly affected. So, for example, we buy very little energy from Russia. Germany's been slow to act because it's a much bigger problem for them, a huge problem for them. But in taking the action they have, they've taken that very big problem on the chin. And I don't think it's fair to say that we have. We have two problems. Firstly, we are resistant as a government, in government terms, to taking refugees in any large numbers. So we haven't taken them, and we're slow in dealing with it. And the second thing is, to be drawing up a list at this stage, as we're apparently doing, of to be sanctioned oligarchs, given that we've been through Litvinenko and the Skripals and through Crimea, seems to me to be absolutely extraordinary. I don't understand it. I don't understand why that list wasn't ready to go the moment that it became clear that Putin was going to try and take Ukraine. One further point with regard to what Danny said about SWIFT and leaving some sanctions till later. Later's now. We've already passed later. I mean, I would have said the same thing conceivably about 2 or 3 days ago, but now later is
the reason we haven't done it though, David, is because of German oil and gas supply rather. So rather does cut kind of across the point that you've just made. I don't disagree with you that I actually think the whole strategy of holding back sanctions doesn't work. That's why we've done it, but I can understand the reasons why we've done it, the argument for doing it, but I probably with you in the end wouldn't do it. But that's the reason why they've done it. All I'm saying is that all of Europe is now struggling with the size of the problem that we now face. I just don't think while it's right for us to concentrate on those things where we can rise to the occasion even more, I don't think it's fair to suggest that we haven't been doing that. I think the response has been strong, and we've actually been one of the forces inside the European Union, inside Europe. Obviously, one of the problems not being in the European Union, but we've been one of the forces inside Europe and the Atlantic Alliance, arguing for stronger policies and getting them as well.
Yeah, but not the ones that affect us, Danny. I mean, and that's the point that I'm really making. We've been arguing for stronger measures that affect other countries more.
That's not true. The SWIFT,
actually, it is true. And when it comes down to the things which,
banking.
I'm not talking about SWIFT banking. I'm talking about the refugees, and I'm also talking about the sanctions on oligarchs. Both of things which affect us because of the intertwining of the oligarchs' money with London and London finances and so on, and the refugees because we know there's blowback from people about taking refugees. Yet we could have done what the EU has already done, and I do not understand why we don't. And it does seem to me that where we actually have to hazard things politically for this government. In other words, what I'm saying, Danny, is it talks a big talk, this government. It always says the big words, and behind it, I don't think the action quite fits that.
That's a fair criticism of the things they haven't done and not a fair reflection of the things that they have. And so therefore, uncharacteristically, it's simply not a fair assessment of their contribution, right? I agree. I think for every country in the world, there are things that they could have seen that didn't see, there are things they could have done, they haven't done. That there are all of those things. And this government is in no different position to anyone else. It's right to make the points that you make. We can go further. We should press for them to go further. It's simply not a reasonable assessment of the country's contribution that it hasn't stepped up. It has done so, and in very many extremely significant ways. And you're quite correct, it also hasn't done so in other significant ways, but that's only half the picture, and it's not right only to deal with half the picture.
I suppose it's interesting that the calculation, I suppose, that leaders had made, probably all leaders have been making, is that, well, we can't do this because they won't do that. And actually, there was a moment last week which really did bring everyone together, and everyone has acted simultaneously. Boris Johnson's just speaking in Poland, actually. We just dip in to see what he's saying.
He has said and written in the last year. The UK, our government, first considered sending weapons to our Ukrainian friends because we read Putin's semi-mystical essay on the future of Ukraine, amounting to a manifesto for imperial expansion. That's why in January we sent 2,000 anti-tank missiles. Now, more than 25 nations are prepared to send defensive lethal aid. in support of the principle of a country's right to protect itself. And I thank Chancellor Scholz of Germany for his speech, which I believe was of world historical significance. We should recognize the gravity of Germany's latest decisions, which have arisen from Putin's aggression. When I spoke to President Biden and fellow leaders last night, we focused on the humanitarian emergency that is now beginning. Putin's invasion has already forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee their homes, and we must prepare for an even larger outflow, perhaps numbered in the millions. Putin has already welcomed many thousands of refugees Poland has already welcomed many thousands of refugees with compassion and practical help. And the UK will provide up to £220 million of emergency and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And I've placed 1,000 troops on standby to help the humanitarian response in neighbouring countries, including in Poland. Many people in Britain will, of course, want to help Ukrainian refugees. So we will make it easier for Ukrainians already living in the UK to bring their relatives to our country. And though the numbers are hard to calculate, they could be more than 200,000. And if the worst happens, and President Zelensky's government is no longer able to function in Kiev, we must prepare to support them whatever happens in the weeks ahead. And we should recognize that this crisis will impose costs on ourselves and on our electorates, that sanctions have consequences for us as well as for Russia. And no step is free from risk. And whatever
let's just
difficulties ahead,
let's just duck in there, because it's an interesting what Boris Johnson was just saying in Warsaw, outlining £220 million in emergency and humanitarian aid, 1,000 troops on standby. It's interesting. I've been still joined by Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch. Interesting, Boris Johnson again making this point that there are costs to Britain at home as well, and it feels like this is a message that all senior ministers are trying to land right now. That this is not something that's happening a long way away. That we are, actually, to a large extent, conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on passed off without huge impacts back here at home. But this is all the decisions being taken against Putin have real life impacts back at home as well, Danny.
Yes, they do. Look, my view is that this is just at the beginning of what will be, a battle in Ukraine, but also a long-standing war against autocracy and for democracy, and that the costs of it will be quite high, and the risks as well. And David's right. The question we have to face now will be a big moral question about the how much risk we're willing to take ourselves in a nuclear situation to defend the Ukrainian population and its right to independent statehood. It's a very big challenge. We didn't make them members of NATO, and there was a sort of reason for that. So there is a question as over whether or not the guarantees that we make to those countries outside NATO and inside NATO should be the same. These are very, very difficult questions. This morning there's a lot of people saying, well, we should declare a no-fly zone, which is absolutely fine until people start firing each other, and we have to decide whether we're willing to go as far as that. I've just been studying 1956 and what happened when the Russians invaded Hungary, and effectively we ended up doing nothing at all in those situations. We thought it was too dangerous. Well, our response to it has been better than that. But it's a question as to, I suppose that Eisenhower would have responded, well, what are you going to do once the Russians achieve their objective? Because it seems quite likely to me they will take Kiev.
David, it just feels as if we've gone from one extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime situation with the pandemic. All the restrictions are torn up on Thursday, the very day the tanks rolled into Ukraine, and we are right into another one.
It really does. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the latest IPCC report was talking about what's already baked in with regard to climate change. So there you face a number of kind of crises, which are not a crisis, we're not exactly interlocking, but which are which take a terrible toll on people actually, and their resilience. And so resilience is absolutely going to be the key word that we have to look at in all kinds of ways over the next 5 to 10 years. And I kind of feel I find kind of existentially guilty towards, my children and coming grandchildren about the state of things, really, and about the complacency with which we've gone through the last 40 or so years, not aware we couldn't have kind of known anything differently. But that's how I see. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about it. However, we are going to face an incredibly difficult choice, quite possibly within the course of the next week, whether we are prepared to allow Putin to take over Ukraine unchallenged militarily, or whether that's what we've got to do and then how we deal with the consequences, or whether we decide we can't allow that to happen. And I can't call that right now. I just kind of, and forgive me for this, but I'm deeply depressed that that's where we are.
Yeah, I don't, by the way, think, I think on the contrary from feeling a sense of guilt that that we've been complacent, I think the last 40 years has been an extraordinary achievement. What we're fighting for is to try to preserve that. I don't think this has occurred as a result of our complacency. It's occurred as a result of the fact that evil is extremely difficult to eliminate in this world and to contain. It just is. And I don't feel that, but I do share David's concern about what we do next. In truth, saying we don't know what to do in the hope that maybe it'll come to us in the next few days is probably not going to come to us in the next few days. The dilemma that we have will be the same in a week's time.
Well, I mean, so one of the things that you suddenly think is it possible to organize some form of provisions lift into Kiev and so on? Can we do that? And if the Russians then fire upon it, then we have to cope with it then. These are real kind of, a no-fly zone, we probably can't, I mean, even if it wasn't to cause a direct confrontation, is we almost certainly can't do it at this. We probably don't have the logistics to do it in any case. But we could organize a humanitarian airlift, which if the Russians then opposed it, there would be a loss of life. So it's bloody easy for me to say, isn't it? Because I wouldn't be flying one of those planes or whatever. But those are the things that we're going to be faced with. And then there's going to be the question of people going over the borders into Ukraine to fight, and then the question about whether the Russians will then attempt cross-border incursions into NATO countries. All these things are likely to arise within the course of the next few weeks, and we're going to have answers for them. But they're not British government answers. They're alliance answers. They're the West's answers. They're what we have to look at together. That's the critical point about this. Concentrating in the near future on what the British government does on anything except, let's say, refugees and so on, is largely pointless.
I do agree with that.
Just finally, do you think that we have those alliances? I mean, our international alliances haven't been brilliant in the last couple of years. Do you feel like that's having any impact on our ability to come to some sort of agreement now, Danny?
Well, inevitably, it will have some impact. Yes, inevitably it will. But on the other hand, in the area of defence and security, we are particularly strong, and that to some extent offsets the disadvantage we've put ourselves under as a negotiating partner. But it doesn't eliminate it.
Well, it's lovely to speak to you, as ever, although somebody's just texted in saying usually feel a bit calmed over what the situation is after Finkelvich. Not today. Anyway, there we are. Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch, thanks very much for joining us, as ever, as they do every Tuesday morning here on Times Radio.